Are you seeing one screen or two?
Two.
One.
Yay!
There you go.
Okay, great. Like I say, welcome back to this conversation. Today we're going to talk about Buddhism, and I'm going to kick this one off today. So a little bit about how I got introduced to Buddhism more than just 2 class sessions in college. I don't know, many of you may have done this at some point, but certainly during the 70s, the book by Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, was real popular. And a number of us read it, and it will show up again a little bit later in this discussion. And so I was curious, just from that book, which was a novel about the historical Buddha and his life and how he sort of came to the point of enlightenment. So I was fascinated by that, and so my interest sort of went underground for a while. I didn't have a lot to do with it for many years. When I went off to Duke to do my doctoral work, that was far outside, Buddhism was far outside my world of study. And I don't think, even when I was the interim Episcopal campus minister at Duke, I don't remember there being any Buddhists on the religious council. I don't remember there being a Buddhist student group or anything like that at Duke in the 90s. So, I mean, we were in the South, and, it was not as prominent in that case as it was in other places. But then when I went to Berkeley to be the Episcopal campus minister at Berkeley, and I became part of the religious council there, and my interest in interfaith work had been piqued, as I mentioned, I think last week, by Bishop Bill Swing and his formation of United Religions Initiative, that I began to want to contact with some of the Buddhists that were there in Berkeley. And so one of the first people that I went to make an appointment with, to sit down with, is the gentleman up on the upper right hand of the screen, Hung Shur. And Hung is not his first name and Shur is not his last name. He just goes by Hung Shur. If you address him as Hung Shur. He, I don't remember all of his story, but he's an Anglo, and he came to Buddhism in his 20s, I think, if I remember correctly. And he chose a monastic Buddhist branch, Chan Buddhism, which is Chinese Zen, or maybe you could say that Zen is Chinese Chan. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit as we move on. And so he was this sole monk in this monastery there in downtown Berkeley, and he and his associates did and continue to do daily meditations and offer retreats and all sorts of things. He was a wonderfully gentle man. I remember sitting with him and having a conversation, and I was watching him. You can see his glasses. I was watching an ant crawl along the temple of his glasses, and finally he noticed it, and he very gently took off his glasses, and there was a plant next to his chair, and he sort of brushed the ant off onto the chair. And I was so struck by that, because I would have gone like that. And it was just part of his nature to be gentle and considerate and kind in that way. And so he taught me a lot about sort of Chan or monastic Buddhism. And then just right down the street from my office was the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. And there the resident minister was a gentleman by the name of Hosan Hardiman. Now, Hosan hailed from, I think, Philadelphia, and he had a strong Philadelphia East Coast accent. And so it was really odd to call the Berkeley Buddhist Temple and get this, hello, you've reached the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, this sort of East Coast accent. Berkeley Buddhist Temple is part of what's known as the Buddhist Churches of America. And this is a slightly different branch of Buddhism certainly than the monastic Buddhism. And it's really what developed in Japan as sort of Buddhism for everybody. I likened it, and I told Hosan this. We met for lunch every, I don't know, a couple of months or so, and I told him, that the the Buddhist Churches of America was kind of like Buddhist Presbyterianism. And he said, yeah, that's about right. People go to work, they do their stuff, and they come to church on Sunday. And their services were on Sunday morning because that was when people weren't working. And they had Sunday school. They just called it Dharma school. It looked just like a mainline Protestant church, only with Buddhist sort of trappings. And so those were my two main introductions. Of course, in Berkeley, there was a Tibetan temple, and I visited that a couple of times with students. So the nice thing about being in that melting pot that's the Bay Area is that there are a lot of different ways to learn about the different branches of Buddhism, and I cherish that and learned a lot from them. So with that as my introduction, Bishop Epting will give his in a little bit, but we're going to show a brief video. This one's about 10 or 11 minutes long, and this one is a video on an introduction to Buddhism. The speaker is, I'm not quite sure what nationality, is Asian of some sort, either Chinese or Japanese, and trust that you will be able to hear everything that she has to say. I want to make sure I got share computer sound. Yep, here we go.
Yep, she is Chinese.
Good afternoon. Happy Father's Day. I'm Mel Shi, and I'm really honored to be here to just talk about Buddhism in general. I think a lot of people are very curious.
You may have to turn it up on your computer. It's up as loud as I can get it.
Christians, anyone, I think, in the West, especially these days, I think there's a lot of curiosity about Buddhism. Buddha, okay, the word Buddha actually means the enlightened one. Okay, the enlightened one. Dharma are the teachings, okay, of Buddhism. Sakyamuni Buddha, okay, Sakyamuni Buddha is a historic Buddha. He was a prince, and he gave up the throne, he gave up the family, and what we call renounce the family life or the home life, okay, to practice. And the reason for his doing so is in search of what we call the truth of the universe, okay? So that's, and if you understand Indian history, okay, it's the practice is they're thinkers, they're philosophers. So they want to practice, they want to find, to seek the truth. And back then, their practice, even today, I think their practice is what we call the aesthetic practice is you just torture the body, okay? And by torturing the body, it was hoped that we would liberate the spirit. And this is how they achieve liberation and find the truth, okay? So Prince Siddhartha left his family, and actually he practiced for 6 years, ascetic practice. And then he found out that that is not the way. That is not the way to find the truth. So he kind of came back a little bit, and then he eventually meditated and on the day that we call the day of his enlightenment, okay, and he was enlightened to the truth of the universe. Okay, here are some of the core teachings that I would like to share, okay, some core teachings of Buddhism. When Sakyamuni Buddha first attained enlightenment, the first teachings that he taught is the Four Noble Truths. I'm sure maybe some of you have heard of that, the Four Noble Truths. And this is also a cause of a lot of misconception as well, because the first Noble Truth is called suffering. Who wants to suffer? when the Buddha talked about suffering, it's just telling us, okay, life can be just unsatisfactory. Okay, we may not be too happy for too long. Okay, and actually that will be another concept called impermanence. All right, and then of course the Buddha continued to teach on the cause of suffering. So why are we always unhappy or unsatisfied, and what is the cause of all this unsatisfactoriness? Quite a mouthful, right? What the Buddha said is our craving. It's our craving. It's the need for gratification. Is that we always want to fulfill, to gratify our senses. But can we keep at that all the time? We try our best to do that. Okay, so this is the cause of suffering, because sometimes we cannot fulfill our wishes. So that is the cause of our suffering, or the craving. And then third noble truth is actually we can stop that. Okay, the cessation of suffering. And sometimes the cessation of suffering is also called nirvana. Wow, what a term, right? Nirvana. And of course, nirvana is a Sanskrit word. A lot of misconception about nirvana as well. Okay, for some people, nirvana is the cup of coffee in the morning, or maybe a triple chocolate cake, or maybe a nice plate of pasta, I don't know, or maybe a steamboat of rice. Okay, whatever. Okay, so what is nirvana? Actually, nirvana is zero. You say, what? Okay, what is zero? That means you are at that state that you don't have any kind of positive, negative. That's why it's called cessation. It's zero. You're still, you're completely still. You don't have craving, you don't care for craving, and you don't care for gratification, you don't care for pain, of course, you don't care for any of that. It's actually zero. So that's complete stillness, cessation, okay? And how do we achieve that? So that's the fourth noble truth, path to the cessation of suffering. So the Buddha said actually we should go the middle way, the middle path. Okay, so just kind of pull things more to the center, okay? And it's important that we have right view. The right view is how do we look at life? Right contemplation is how we actually look at, it's just not just view, it's how we really contemplate and think of all these truths, so to speak, all right? And it's more like, the first two is more like the mental, the spiritual, okay, conception. And then of course we all have to live. Right speech, okay, what is right speech? It's not that I speak good Chinese or I speak good English, of course. Right speech is how we communicate and say things. Are we telling the truth? Or are we being divisive? Are we wasting time and just talking nonsense, gossip? Or are we just very harsh at people, use harsh words, swear words? And nowadays, of course, speech is not just talking, it's texting, right? And all those tweets and whatever you call it, okay? Those, okay, it's all the back and forth that, and actually speech can do a lot of harm, because it can be abusive. You can hurt someone with just one phrase. Okay, you can ruin someone. Okay, so that's why we have to be careful with how we talk. In Buddhism, there are commandments in Christianity. In Buddhism, we have the precepts, and the first precept is that we vow to refrain from killing. Okay, so we do not take lives. That's why we're vegetarian, because we don't want to take a life for our food. And then, of course, we do not steal. Then we refrain from not having sexual misconduct, okay? And for monastic is we celibate, so there's no sexual conduct. And then, of course, speech will be lying. And then the last precept is to refrain from taking any intoxicants. And in the old days, it's actually alcohol. But now, there's much more beyond than alcohol that can impair our minds, okay? So those are what we call the 5 precepts. In Buddhism, middle path. Middle path is also, a guide, okay? A very important guideline for our practice is to go the middle way. And right mindfulness. Okay, mindfulness is, again, a big practice, a major practice in Buddhism. That means we are focused. So that's why we meditate. If we are mindful of what we say, if we are mindful of what we do, we would make better decisions. We will not be hurting others. We would actually benefit ourselves more. So right mindfulness in our practice. And lastly, right concentration. Okay, concentration and mindfulness, it seems that it's kind of close. But concentration is more like meditative concentration. In the Buddhist time, there are people who want to practice meditative concentration with the goal to attain what we call supernatural powers. Okay, so that would not be right concentration. Okay, so that's I would say nowadays it's maybe not so easy. Okay, to attain what we call supernatural powers. So that's right concentration. So that's the basic what we call the path. Okay, the path that could lead to the, liberation or the cessation, okay, of suffering. We're born, we get old, and we get sick. We like it or not, we all age and get sick. Nobody likes that, but it's kind of a little beyond our control. And then eventually we'll pass away, okay? Of course, in Buddhism, we believe that we can be reborn. We can be reborn, but it's not the same as the ancient Indian, or even today, okay, they believe in is the reincarnation is you come back as the same class or whatever, because the Buddha taught that is our karma that may actually dictate our next birth. Okay, we can be born into heaven. It's very difficult. Okay, it's not that easy. We do have to be a very good person. Okay, or we can be born into different realms. Okay, so things go in cycle. Okay, so it's a cyclic. Okay, life never dies actually. Okay, it's actually taking up a different physical form in a different realm of existence.
So just real quickly, a couple of slides just about those 4 noble truths. Suffering is key, and suffering's origin is desire or craving. And to get out of it, you can overcome suffering. And how do you do that? You follow the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's sort of, there's a nice sort of linear way of thinking about it. That doesn't necessarily mean that following the Eightfold Path is easy. The right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood. I heard someone give a long conversation about what right livelihood would consist of. And there were certain things that just weren't, they didn't see as part of right livelihood. I mean, it would make sense if you're not supposed to take a life that you would work in a slaughterhouse, for example. There was a similar thing in early Christianity about what professions you should not be a part of if you wanted to be a Christian in early Christianity. So this is not unusual, but that Noble Eightfold Path, and usually often you'll see as a symbol of Buddhism that wheel of Dharma, thing that looks like a ship's wheel, often is adopted as the symbol of Buddhism. And then just wanted to show when the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. That was where he was sitting, was under the Bodhi tree in a town that's now called Bodh Gaya. And this is a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And there on that map, you can see where Buddhism started and how it expanded. And the red arrows are the Mahayana tradition, what's known as the greater vehicle, the one that is accessible to sort of more folk than just the monastic. The green tradition, the Theravada tradition, is mostly down in South Asia and is characterized by monasticism. It certainly moved far beyond that, but it's that red tradition that developed into Chan Buddhism and then Zen Buddhism, which you see moving into Japan and Korea. Those of you who were at the celebration of new ministry may have noticed a gentleman, tall gentleman in a very red robe. His name is Claude Destray, and he's a faculty person in the School of Law at DU. But he holds lineage in both a Korean Zen tradition. In other words, he's ordained as a Korean Zen, but he also holds lineage in this blue tradition, the Vajrayana Tantric tradition. He holds lineage from the Dalai Lama. So he's got training in both a very sort of semi-mystical tradition like the Vajrayana Tantric tradition, as well as the Zen tradition. And he'll talk to you in either one. He was dressed, he asked me whether he should come dressed as a Korean or as a Tibetan. And I said, the Tibetan gown is better looking. And he said, yeah, I think so too. So he came in the red one rather than in the brown one, which looked more like our speakers. So just to sort of wrap things up or tie things up in a package before Bishop Epting starts in, we didn't do the Prothero interview, but just to sort of use that framework, which a number of you said was really, really helpful. I just wanted to put what the video said and some of these other things in that same framework, so you might be able to see how they map across. So in Buddhism, the problem is suffering. We all suffer. The solution is attaining nirvana, which is the extinguishing of suffering. The speaker said that nirvana is zero. Apparently, and I heard this in a couple of different places, the word really relates to extinguishing, blowing out. So what you're actually doing is extinguishing suffering, blowing it out, and that craving. And how do you do it? Through meditation, and then of course following the four or the eightfold path. And who are the exemplars? There are 18 arhats. These are folks in some of the traditions that have actually attained Buddhahood. There are 18 of them, and some Buddhists think that they copped out because they said, yep, I can become a Buddha, I'm gonna do it. And so they just sort of left. Those that have a little bit more respect are the bodhisattvas. And bodhisattvas are these who have attained the level of being able to enter nirvana, but have said, I'm not going to do it as long as there is anybody else who has not already attained it. So they hold themselves out of attaining nirvana out of compassion for all of the rest of us who have not gotten so far. So the bodhisattvas in some traditions have almost achieved a status of divinity in some Buddhist thinking, but the argument about whether Buddhists believe in God or another one sort of gets really fuzzy around the bodhisattvas and in different traditions. And then there are the lamas, the teachers, the respected teachers like the Dalai Lama, who are exemplars and revered by Buddhists in various traditions. And there are lamas in the Mahayana, the Zen tradition, just like there are in the Theravada or the Vajrayana tradition. So that is kind of the mapping out of Buddhism in the four schemas of Stephen Prothero: suffering, extinguishing suffering, meditation, and the living out the Noble Eightfold Path, and then these exemplars. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bishop Epting, and he'll talk about how the Episcopal Church has engaged these various levels of Buddhism. And then when he is done, we'll have general conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, Gary. A helpful beginning. I said last week that at least on a national level or a church-wide level, it's probably better to do interreligious dialogue ecumenically, that is, in partnership with other Christians, because it's not Episcopal Buddhist dialogue, it's Christian Buddhist dialogue. So if we could keep a broader focus on our side, it might be helpful to engage another religion, which has its own complexities, of course. The obvious organ for that kind of dialogue in this country for Christians is something called the National Council of Churches. You've probably heard of that over the years. After World War II, the World Council of Churches was founded in the first blush of international cooperation, which also resulted in the United Nations and the World Bank, all headquartered in Geneva for a time, and the World Council is headquartered there today. That was after the war. Then in 1950, the National Council of Churches was formed in this country as a kind of chapter of the World Council of Churches. And there are really national councils of churches in various places around the world. I once did a conference with the National Council of Churches in Cuba. So each nation has this kind of ecumenical body made up of various, mostly Protestant denominations. The NCC today is made up of 38 member Christian bodies: Protestant and Anglican, Orthodox, Evangelical, African American, and the historic peace churches, Quakers and Mennonites. And they represent really some 40 million of us Christians. The National Council is a kind of mouthpiece or voice for 40 million Christians in this country. The Episcopal Church was a founding member of the National Council in 1950 and remains a central player and a constant presence there today. Its mission is to work for church unity, obviously, and foster conversation and dialogue, but also in coordinating joint actions for justice and peace in the name of Christ. National Council of Churches, the NCC, has a storied history of civil rights work and peace work in a variety of ways. When I served on the governing board of the NCC in the early 2000s, a number of us urged the organization to get more involved in interfaith or interreligious dialogue. Obviously, Jewish Christian and Muslim Christian, the other monotheistic faiths, the Abrahamic siblings, was a good place to start. And that's where the interfaith work of the National Council began. It took 10 years for the National Buddhist Christian Dialogue to get started. It was not started until 2018, a number of years after my retirement. So I was not able to participate in that directly. Convening this dialogue, as you can see the picture on the bottom or the left side of the screen, in the center is Dr. Gwen Guibord, whom I mentioned last week. So the Guibord Center was a player in this. The Fo Guangshan Hislai Temple, the Claremont School of Theology, and the University of the West. All of those came together to form the sort of Christian half of the dialogue with Buddhism. Gary mentioned the rich sort of religious and cultural mix on the West Coast, and the National Council found that to be true. They're based in New York City, just like the Episcopal Church is, and for all the diversity in New York, it doesn't hold a candle, at least as far as the Eastern thought is concerned, to Southern California or San Francisco or the West Coast in general. So that's why the Guibord Center came into play to help coordinate the National Council's work. The agenda is still relatively new. They're just getting started, really. It takes a while. You know, you can only meet so often. Of course, the COVID has slowed everything down. They're meeting somewhat like we are on Zoom, discussing theology, discussing community life, and social issues. Now, I think it's safe to say that for Buddhism, as for many religions, its complex nature has made the going a bit complicated. And the most progress has been made in joining social witness together, in planning events and actions that have to do with peace and justice together. There's a policy statement written in 2019 that says The focus on peace draws us, the National Council, deeper into our existing work and commitments in interreligious relations, that is, with Jews and Muslims, but adds new dialogues with Buddhists, Hindus, and Sikhs. Draws us into active peace building with our neighbors of various faiths. My guess is that this kind of dialogue is going to be more fruitful and successful with something that is sometimes called engaged Buddhism of the late Thich Nhat Hanh than with the more traditional, perhaps, forms of Buddhism. But we could talk about that. Thich Nhat Hanh was exiled from Vietnam in 1966 among the many Buddhist opponents of the war. You remember the Buddhist nun who set herself on fire during those years in protest. Nhat Hanh was exiled and spent time in Europe after he expressed opposition to the war and was only allowed to return to Vietnam in 2018. And he lived there until he died just last month, January 22nd of last month, of complications of a brain tumor, which he had struggled with for years, an inoperable brain tumor. Engaged Buddhism is a kind of umbrella term then for a Buddhist social movement, like the Episcopal Peace Fellowship or one of those kinds of efforts. It emerged in Asia in the 20th century, and it sought ways to apply Buddhist social ethics and insights from meditation and the teachings of the Buddhist Dharma to contemporary issues of social, political, environmental, and economic suffering and injustice. I know some of you from the book club at least are familiar with perhaps the smallest and the most famous Buddhist Christian dialogue, and that is with Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop in Southern Africa, and the Dalai Lama. They had a number of dialogues, but the one that I think you're familiar with mostly perhaps is the Book of Joy. It was recorded by an editor, Douglas Abrams. Those two saints came together. I think that their joy of their encounter and their friendship that has developed over the years came through even in the written book itself. I was blessed to meet and spend some time with Desmond twice in my life, once when he came to Iowa and once at the House of Bishops meeting in Houston, Texas, where he came to be with us for a week. And I understand Gary had that experience as well, and even has met the Dalai Lama. I have not had that blessing in my life. I'm just going to close my input today with just a couple of paragraphs, if you'll allow me, from the Book of Joy, which some of you will remember. And it highlights one of the difficulties, I admit, one of my own difficulties with Buddhism. But it also heightens and underlines how one can be absolutely faithful to one's own religious tradition while engaging respectfully and even lovingly disagreeing with your dialogue partner. Desmond and the Dalai Lama do that to some degree all over throughout this conversation. But these couple of paragraphs, I think, will highlight that. The Dalai Lama here is talking about mental immunity. And it's sort of like getting to nirvana, that point of the cessation of suffering. In this case, particularly dealing with anxiety and fear. So he says mental immunity, the Dalai Lama explained, is just learning to avoid the destructive emotions and to develop the positive ones. First, we must understand the mind. There's so many different states of mind, the diverse thoughts and emotions we experience on a daily basis. Some of these thoughts and emotions are harmful, even toxic, while others are healthy and healing. The former disturb our minds and cause much mental pain. The latter bring us true joyfulness. When we understand this reality, it's much easier to deal with the mind and to take preventive measures. This is how we develop mental immunity. And just as a healthy immune system and healthy constitution protects your body against potentially hazardous viruses and bacteria, mental immunity creates a healthy disposition of the mind so that it will be less susceptible to negative thoughts and feelings. Think about it this way. If your health is strong, when viruses come, they will not make you sick. If your overall health is weak, even small viruses will be very dangerous for you. Similarly, if your mental health is sound, then when disturbances come, you will have some distress, but quickly recover. If your mental health is not good, then small disturbances, small problems will cause you much pain and suffering. You will have much fear and worry, much sadness and despair, much anger and aggravation. People would like to be able to take a pill that makes their fear and anxiety go away and makes them immediately feel peaceful. This is impossible. One must develop the mind over time and cultivate mental immunity. People often ask me for the quickest and best solution to a problem. Again, this is impossible. You can have the quickest or you can have the best solution, but not both. The best solution to our suffering is mental immunity, but it takes time to develop. Yes, the Archbishop replied, you have answered very well. You always answer very well, but you've done this one quite well. The only thing I think is that people sometimes get quite annoyed with themselves unnecessarily, especially when they have thoughts and feelings that are really quite natural. Basically, the Archbishop continued, I think we've got to accept ourselves as we are, and then hope to grow in much the same way the Dalai Lama described. I mean, getting to know what things that trigger us. These are the things you can train, you can change. We ought not to be ashamed of ourselves. We're human, and sometimes it's a good thing that we recognize that we have human emotions. Now the thing is being able to say, when is it appropriate? Throughout the week of dialogues, the Archbishop said many times that we should not berate ourselves for our negative thoughts and emotions, that they are natural and unavoidable. They're only made more intense, he argued, by the glue of guilt and shame when we think we should not have them. Dalai Lama agreed that human emotions are natural, but he did argue about whether they are unavoidable. Mental immunity, he explained, is the way to avoid them. So Gary just talked about grace in his sermon today, and maybe that's kind of what I tussle with, but I'm not here to argue with these religions, and I would be more than happy to be enlightened, not only by the Buddha, but by your discussion about whether any of this perhaps troubles you as well. I've often said that I could see myself probably as a monotheistic Hindu, a conservative Jew, or a Sufi Muslim, but I really struggle with Buddhism's seeming sort of mind over matter approach. If you just work hard enough, then you can free yourself from the destructive or negative emotions. Desmond seems to come down on the side of it's okay to have those from time to time. Don't be so hard on yourself. I don't know, I'm probably missing something here. And as I say, I would be more than happy to be enlightened by our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Bishop. So we're open for questions, comments, all that kind of stuff. What do you want to know? What did you think? What's missing? I know that last week, Mark Kelly asked a question about sort of derivation of Buddhism from Hinduism, and the Sakyamuni Buddha or Siddhartha was born into a Hindu family of very, very high caste, and of course the story is that he was shielded from suffering by his family, and he finally got out of the compound and started seeing suffering and death and aging, and that was what really sort of sent him on his path. So he went out of that, and he thought, well, the right thing is to do is to live as a sannyasin, to live as a hermit. And he didn't. That was that far to one side experience that he found didn't give the answers, and pure hedonism didn't give the answers either. So that he charted that middle way. But it certainly came out of Buddhism. The whole question of rebirth was a Buddhist concept, and karma and dharma, all sort of grew out of that Hindu South Asian milieu, and he took them and adapted and adopted them in different ways. So yeah, there was that lineage, if you want to use that language, coming out of Hinduism, but he took it in a different way as well. So I don't know if what we talked about or what you saw helped answer those questions, Mark, or okay, cool. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, this is Whit. What struck me is that we talk about the major religions of the world, and those of us who believe in a God, a single God, that to me kind of describes religion, in that believe in something greater than ourselves. Sounds to me like Buddhism is more a way of life than a religion.
Yeah. That's a good a question. If you were to do, and I can probably find it, I'll see if I can find it and throw it into the chat. If you listen to the interview with Prothero, which we didn't use this time, he's asked that question about whether or not Buddhism is a religion. Because, or is it a philosophy, or is it a self-help gimmick, or all of these kinds of things? And it raises the question that scholars of religion struggle with: is what is a definition of religion? Can you have a religion that does not have God? And Confucianism and Buddhism are usually held up as the two exemplars of non-theistic religions. But scholars of religion really do debate this. Do you have to have a God to be a religion? And I remember when I was at Duke, there was a guy in the religious studies department. He wasn't hired to do this, but he started doing it as I was there. He wanted to teach a class in atheism because he argued that atheism belongs in the religion department, rather than in the philosophy department. So it's a tricky thing. You're raising a really, really good question for which there is no simple answer.
Some of you will remember we had a very controversial bishop in the Episcopal Church named Jack Spahn. Bishop John S. Spahn was Bishop of Newark, and I knew Jack as well. And he was very controversial in some of his theological writings, and he declared that he was no longer a theist. And everybody said, "Well, you don't believe in God anymore." No, he said theism has this sense of the God who's up in heaven somewhere, and we have to climb up to heaven to get there. Has a personality and a body, perhaps, and all of that. And he believed in a much more amorphous understanding, but he clearly still believed in the divine. I expect there are Buddhists who are in that kind of category as well. Again, with the complexity of all these religions, you will have some that are probably more religious, just like you have some Hindus that are more monotheistic and others who we might think of as polytheistic. But I agree. I mean, I think it probably falls more on the side of a philosophy in some ways. And yet it has religious practices like meditation, even prayer, if you will, living a moral and ethical life, not doing bad things. We always associate those with religious precepts as well. So interesting, though.
I had a great course at the University of Northern Colorado when it was still Colorado State College on Eastern history. And my task, because it was sort of a graduate student beginning course, was on Confucianism. And so I also had to study Taoism. And Taoism, I always had the feeling was closer to our Native American idea of nature and being one with nature, and that the divine was in nature, if there was a divine, but it was in nature. And Confucius was more like Socrates, he was more the philosopher. And so I've never thought of Confucianism as a religion. I've thought of it as a philosophy. And I have found it's so interesting in history that these interesting minds are contemporary with each other, and trying to guide us we humans, in a way that makes us good people. I guess that's it. Good people. Like I tell my dog he's a good dog. Well, I think we're good people. But it's I've never thought of Confucianism, because I did spend the time really studying it, as being religious. Taoism is more, but I relate it to Native American attitude toward nature and the oneness of nature and being at one with nature. We Christians who grew up in the early part of the 20th century can probably remember going to church camp and climbing the mountain and getting to the cross and being quiet and meditating and praying. We did that this fall when we went to our various outdoor altars. Being one with nature is a way of touching the divine. So I have no problem with that. But I do understand what Bishop Epting is saying about Buddhism and the idea that, yes, we are in control of what will happen to us. I think there is a divine presence, and I've certainly felt it in my life many times. So I can't be converted.
Herman,
I
I
just
think
looked
that's
up-
such a great
Oh.
point about, oh, sorry, go ahead, Father Gary.
No, you go.
I was just going to say that I loved Irma's point on Confucianism versus Taoism as maybe a delineation between, what's philosophy and what's religion. I've heard it said that religion could be defined as a handbook for life, for living, with divine guidance. And in that case, it really kind of does split the middle, doesn't it? And there's been, I know, books written by Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama that compares the Buddha with Jesus Christ. And that's my question. Is I don't want to put you two on the spot, but in your studies or thinking, what similarities do you see in those two great teachers?
It's a great question. Well, I think, off the top of my head, they were similar. They taught, right? Wisdom. They did, both of them use kind of imaginative ways of teaching. We think of Jesus as using parables, and then if he did, there's this tradition in the Buddhist side of koans, right? To get you out of your traditional way of thinking. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. What? No, the kingdom of God is the big thing. No, it shakes you out. Well, what's the sound of one hand clapping? So there was this sense that they were teachers of alternative wisdom. They were in that regard, but there was no messianic expectation in 6th century BCE India. They weren't expecting any kind of Messiah or anything like that. So that would be a difference in the way that both Jesus and the Buddha presented themselves. They both attracted followers. In that regard, I'm not sure. There might be traditions of the Buddha doing miracles, but certainly when the Buddha died, he said, don't make relics of me. Don't build all of these things to me. Don't do that. Well, of course, his followers did. One of the things I was listening to, it sounded like Buddha, would have been just as happy for a long time of just sort of doing his own thing and sort of being on his path to nirvana, but his compassion led him to teach. And that's where Buddhism became a missionary religion. We don't think of it that way, but it is a missionary religion. If we go back to that slide about how it really expanded all over Asia, you can see its sort of missionary impulse. So, depending on who you read, which gospels and how you understand the quotations that are attributed to Jesus, did Jesus claim to be God, or was that attributed to him? I'm going to leave that one for another time. Certainly, the Buddha did not claim to be divine, and many of his followers would not allow that of him, but other followers certainly pray to the Buddha as to a god. So, there's that challenge of the historical Buddha and the historical Christ, as well as the challenge of what the followers attributed to the Buddha and what the followers attributed to Jesus. So I don't know, Bishop, do you have something to throw in?
Yeah, that's a great segue. The whole idea of the quest for the historical Jesus is something that New Testament scholars have been dealing with for decades and decades. There's been a more recent upsurge of it. So what was to get back through all the layers of tradition and what may have been attributed to him or may not have been, what was the kernel, the historical Jesus, what was he really like? And some scholars end up saying we can know very little, others suggest we can know a lot more. Clearly he was an historical figure, but so they characterize him sometimes as a wisdom teacher. I know that John Dominic Crosset and Marcus Borg would probably come down that side too. That he was a teacher of wisdom, which is similar to some of these other leaders that we're going to see. He did gather disciples, as many of them did, and taught them. Most of his time was spent forming the disciples, not necessarily preaching to the multitudes, so they could carry on the message, and it was a discipleship religion. If you look carefully through the New Testament, perhaps in the Gospel of John, Jesus usually runs away from things being ascribed to him, as even the term Messiah or Son of God sometimes. And so it's possible that similar to the Buddha in that way, eschewing his own centrality, Jesus might well have said, "Don't worship me, worship the Father. Worship the one who sent me." Of course, we got the Trinitarian theology then, which would unite them in the final analysis anyway. But so I think there are similarities to these leaders, even incarnations. We talked about last week in Hinduism. Incarnations of the divinity in various ways have been looked at in other faiths besides ours. But ours is singular, of course, unique for us.
Well, thanks, guys. That was great.
I'll throw out something that's going to be a little controversial. I can understand in the interfaith efforts that we're trying to reconcile, to a degree, our beliefs with the Muslims and with the Jews, and within Christianity with the Roman Catholics and others. Why do we even engage Buddhists? It doesn't seem like we have any issues with the Buddhists.
So I'll answer this from a perspective that anyway. So I've mentioned twice, and Bishop mentioned it once last week, the United Religions Initiative that Bishop Bill Swing founded back in the late 90s. And his dream, where that came from, and I'm going to get to, I hope this is going to get to your point, Whit. Where that came from was he was asked when he was the Bishop of California to host a service in Grace Cathedral for the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, because it was founded in San Francisco. And so the leaders of the United Nations said, can you host an interfaith service here in the cathedral to do that? And he got to thinking, and he said, wouldn't it be great if the religions of the world got together and thought about issues of the world not constrained by political boundaries? And so what if the Buddhists of the world, the Buddhists and the Christians and the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Jains and all of these groups got together to talk about the problems of the world from a religious standpoint rather than from a political standpoint, where lines on a map or rivers divide things. And so that was part of the founding initiative behind United Religions Initiative. And to that, to your point, Whit, is that understanding and cooperation is different than reconciliation of ideas. And so working with Buddhists and Jains and Hindus and Zarathustrians, Zoroastrians, is not necessarily, we don't want to reconcile, but to understand, and maybe we can realize that we've got similar philosophical underpinnings in certain areas. None of these religions sort of countenance certain things, like nobody wants to see homelessness. So how do we address homelessness from our various religious standpoints, understanding that we have a common task, regardless of any belief in divinity or philosophy. So the work in that kind of thing is helping us understand one another, not to victimize or villainize one another. And so we wouldn't put ourselves in the position, as happened after 9/11, of people shooting Sikhs because they wore turbans thinking that they were Muslims. We didn't understand. Most people didn't understand. And so the understanding piece, I think, is critical for all of us to sort of aim at. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to keep the goals of ecumenism and interfaith separate. That ecumenism is an attempt to bring us together because we are one religion, Christianity. We're Christians, our differences should be able somehow to be reconciled. And there's still many differences, great ones, between our faiths, our denominations, our communions. But the goal of ecumenism is to try to overcome those and to become one church again. The goal of interreligious dialogue is not that at all, but rather, as Gary's well pointed out, understanding, cooperation when we can, not hating one another, realizing that all Muslims are not flying planes into buildings, and therefore hopefully making the world a better and more peaceful place.
Someone else? We've got a few minutes left.
I was thinking about this idea of the sort of a difference of not having a God. And I think one way that I kind of reconcile this is, you have the Brahman in India, the Brahma, the God that sort of, we would say, I think at last time, that he was the deist God. He'd done his thing and backed off. And the point of that God also is that it really has no personality. It is power. It's power, pure power, but not in a personal form. And so if you chose to be an arhat, what you do is leave this world and join that power also without personality. And so there is a God, but not in the way that would satisfy us, because we want to have a personal relationship with this God, and that isn't the option in that faith. Would that make sense?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense to me. Yeah. I think the deist God is a good way to look at some of this, the high God, very, very distant, still there, still, kick things off, but it's not terribly involved on a day-to-day basis.
And without personality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, one of the famous recent atheists, we'll call him that, referred to that as sort of the blind watchmaker. Just sort of put it together and let it go. Okay. Anyone else? Last question.
My neighbor across the street that I've known for 20 years just recently died. He was 86. He had died from the COVID because he didn't believe in the shots. And I totally believe in him. And he's a very conservative Christian fundamentalist. And I'd like to think of myself as a progressive Episcopalian, whatever that title is. I'd like to think I'm in that area. And yet, we never talked religion, but we talked construction because he was a contractor and I was a builder. We talked yards, we talked trees, we talked as neighbors. And I always thought that ecumenicism of a very conservative Christian and what I think is a progressive Christian could transcend that. So there was great sadness when he died, which I didn't think was necessary if he'd have been vaccinated. But there was a wonderful sense of warmth in that we transcended our different religious Christian views and became dear friends. And to this day, I take care of his wife. When it snows, I shovel the driveway and sidewalk so that she can get to the car safely, because it's on a slope and don't want her sliding or falling or hurting herself. So the faith can transcend them if you take time to know them and talk to them and don't just stand there and point at them.